So today we'll have a bit of a different video because I want to answer a question that has been living rent-free in my head for way too long. And you probably know the situation when you've just started a nice stitch and towards the end you notice like that thread is not gonna cut it and you're like a few centimeters short, and that is already very annoying, and that's the bad situation. Otherwise, you might notice towards the end of your stitch that you still have like 60 centimeters of stitching thread left over, which is not a problem, but it also does feel like a waste, right? So the question I want to answer today is, how much sewing thread do you need for your stitch exactly? Because we know there are some rule of thumbs that you can use, and they are already very helpful. But today I want to validate them and also give you an exact formula, if you want to, for calculating how much sewing thread you actually need. So with that out of the way, let's get to our setup. I have 3 groups of leather, where these ones will be done with 3mm irons, these will be done with 4mm irons, and these ones will be done with 5mm irons. And within each of the groups, I again have 3 pieces of leather, where one will be 1mm thick, one will be 2mm thick, and the last one will be 4mm thick. And the reason I'm doing these different variations is that during stitching, we always have to traverse through the leather, which means that the thicker our leather is, the more stitching thread we will need. And of course, also depending on the irons that we use, we also have to go through our leather more often, which also means again that we will need more sewing thread. And so this will also show us then how much is the difference between stitching a 1mm leather with 3mm irons or stitching a 4mm leather with 5mm irons. And all of these pieces will have a stitch line of exactly 20 centimeters, and I will be using 1 meter of sewing thread. And then once all of these are stitched up, we can measure the leftover of the sewing thread and then create a plot from this and then calculate our formula based on that. And maybe I can also give you an updated rule of thumb that you can use for your stitch lines. So let's get all of this sewn up and then we can start measuring. Now after stitching, I'll just measure the rest of our threads and note down the results. Okay, now we got all the measurements, so we can see how does it look. So I'll just be heading over back home, then put together all the results, and then I can show you the graphs. So first of all, the graph, I have the stitching iron size on the x-axis, the thread that was actually needed to complete the stitch on the y-axis, and then we have the different colors for the different sizes of leather that were used. And while I only stitched the 1, 2, and 4mm leather, I also added a few extrapolated data points for the 3mm, so it's a more complete picture, and you can also more easily use this as a reference later on. So the first thing I noticed was that the stitching iron size doesn't really matter as much for thinner leathers, but we can see that it changes more when we get to the thicker leathers. And this also makes sense for me, because for the thicker leathers, every time you go through a hole, you also have to traverse through all of your leather, which uses more and more thread. And then it also makes sense that for the thicker leathers, the stitching iron size actually also plays a bigger role. But that also tells us that unless we work with really, really thick leather, when you're doing like sheath holsters and stuff, then it probably really doesn't matter as much. But then the second point that we can see is that the thickness of the leather does make quite a big difference.
So if we compare the 1mm leather to the 4mm leather, we almost use twice as much thread, which already makes quite a big difference. And this is then also going to come back to the calculation and the formula that we're going to do. But then as a next step, also to make this more usable for everyone, I want to show you a more generalized version. And this is also exactly the reason why I bothered to make every data point like a 20 centimeter long stitch, because of course that is more effort, but that also minimalizes our margin of error. So what I did as a next step is to bring it all down to 1 centimeter of stitch line so that we can use this as a basis for our calculation. And here then you can also see that if we go to the very base version where we just have 1mm of leather and 3mm pricking irons, we only used about 1.2 times the amount of thread compared to our stitch length. But also we need to note that this is just for one side of the thread. So if we take the overall thread length, then we actually need to double these measurements, which means that for the 1mm leather, this would be around 2.4 times the amount of thread compared to the stitch length. And then it would go up about, what do we have, 3.2, 3.8, up to around 4.4 times the amount of thread per stitch line. And this is what we can use then also to derive our formula. And like I said in the beginning, I want to give you an exact formula. And well, there it is. I'll blend it in here. This is the exact formula that we would use if you want to calculate the thread exactly. But I would also advocate this formula probably isn't that useful for most people. I admit, I probably wouldn't use it myself. But that doesn't mean we can take a few things from it and use that as an intuition going forward. And I think that would also be the main point for me, that after doing this for quite a couple years, I already got like a solid intuition for how much thread I need per stitch line and so on. But I think if you want to build this intuition, this can be super helpful. So I will also be making this graph available in the description, so that if you want to download it, print it, put it in your workshop or something like this as a reference material, then you can just have this one. But what I think can be quite useful, or what I will try to keep in my head going forward, is that if I have these thinner leathers, so let's say for the 1mm, like I said, then we would be at around 2.4, but let's go with 2.5 times the thread length per stitch line. So that if we have 10 centimeters of stitch line, I would take 25 centimeters of thread, and then I would still add around 10 centimeters per side, so another 20 centimeters on top of that, because of course when we finish our stitch, we don't want to run completely out of thread, but we always need a few extra centimeters to, handle our needles, and often we also want to add a couple back stitches and so on, which are not accounted for in this one. So with that, I would add another 20 centimeters or so. But then for me, I would just think about, okay, how thick is the leather that I'm stitching? And then based on that, multiply it with 2.5, 3.2, 3.8, 4.5 times. Depending on what you're using, you can just reference this. And I think for me, that is probably the most helpful part that I also took away from this whole experiment. And I've only done the whole experiment now in centimeters, but if any one of you also wants to convert this to inches, then I would be very happy to. You can just put the info in the comments, or then I'll also make a new graph that I can share with everyone else. But otherwise, I hope you learned something. At least for me, it was super interesting, and I think I was able to take away quite a few things from it. And if you did like it, please consider also leaving a like on the video and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this in the future. And then with that, see you next time.